It was a crisp winter evening in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, on December 30th, 1997. The neighborhood was peaceful. The kind of quiet you'd expect to hear on a holiday evening. Homes aglow with Christmas lights, families gathered around the dinner table, and the faint hum of a television in the background. The air was cool but not biting, as if the world outside had paused, awaiting the new year. The night felt strangely perfect. No sounds of sirens, no loud noises, just the kind of quiet that lulled you into a sense of safety. Robert William Pickton, known as Pig Farmer to some and Butcher to others, was known for his reclusive behavior. He lived on the sprawling property, surrounded by pigs and remnants of his previous life. While others in the neighborhood spoke about the oddities surrounding the farm, stories of strange gatherings and questionable activity, few ever dared to speak out or ask questions. Robert was a quiet man, someone who kept to himself and rarely interacted with others, except during those occasional, boisterous gatherings where the boundaries of legality seemed to blur. That night, though, there was no sign of Robert's usual erratic behavior. No guests had arrived, and no sounds of laughter echoed from the barn-turned nightclub. The night seemed tranquil, almost like any other. But something was about to shatter the peace of the neighborhood forever. A woman who had been out that night was missing. This wasn't unusual for the neighborhood, where women from the Downtown Eastside had gone missing before. But this time, there was an unnerving twist. The woman was one of the many prostitutes who frequented the area, women who had long been dismissed by society as insignificant. She was one of the forgotten, but now she had disappeared from the very streets she knew like the back of her hand. Her name was Mona Wilson. She had been last seen leaving a nearby bar, walking toward the familiar dark streets of the East Side. She had a smile on her face, perhaps the result of a night spent in the company of friends or a fleeting moment of joy, the kind of joy that would never be experienced again. By the following morning, Mona's family was frantic. The quiet, sleepy neighborhood of Port Coquitlam was now laced with anxiety, a sense of dread hanging thick in the air. Police were called, and they started searching the area, asking questions. Neighbors peered cautiously from behind curtains, some whispering, some in disbelief. And then came the discovery, something no one could have ever prepared for. On the farm, in a barn that looked more like a tomb than a place for livestock, the first signs of something horrifying were discovered. A purse, carefully hidden among the debris, empty, except for the faintest trace of lipstick on the inside flap. A piece of clothing, a scrap of a torn dress, but it was the faint, almost undetectable smell in the air that made one of the investigators freeze. It was a smell that would haunt the rest of their lives. A woman's blood had been spilled, but where was she, and what had happened on this farm? Could it be that the missing woman had crossed paths with someone who knew this place all too well? The search continued. Investigators scoured the farm for any clues, but everything seemed unnervingly calm. No one was around. The property seemed abandoned, and the eerie quiet only heightened the suspicion. They found nothing that could explain the growing sense of fear and confusion. But something in the back of their minds kept pulling them back to the farm. The strange smell, the broken purse, the hidden items. The signs pointed to something larger, something darker than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of Mona Wilson's purse was just the beginning. As investigators combed the farm, they unearthed chilling clues that pointed toward something far darker than anyone could have imagined. But at first, the signs were subtle, faint traces of human activity buried beneath years of farm waste and debris, hints of a twisted secret that had been lurking in plain sight. Robert Pickton was a man who lived in the shadows. By all accounts, he was quiet, solitary, and almost entirely removed from the community. A butcher by trade, he had spent his youth working at the farm, following in the footsteps of his parents. However, there were whispers about the farm, about Robert, and about strange occurrences that no one dared to ask about. For years, people had been disappearing from Vancouver's downtown east side, a neighborhood rife with sex work and poverty. Yet, these disappearances went largely unnoticed by the authorities, treated as if the lives of these women didn't matter. But Pickton's farm, seemingly innocent at first glance, had become a macabre sanctuary for his depraved desires. As the investigation into Mona Wilson's disappearance continued, the police started to realize that this wasn't an isolated incident. There was something far more disturbing beneath the surface. A breakthrough came when one of Pickton's employees, who had been working on the farm, made a shocking discovery. Among the discarded items in a barn, the employee found several purses belonging to women who had gone missing. The alarm bells began ringing. How could these items, these personal belongings, end up on Pickton's farm? And why had no one thought to investigate sooner? It was then that the police were finally granted a search warrant for the farm, but they had no idea how horrifying their findings would be. On February 6, 2002, they entered the Pickton property in search of illegal firearms. What they found instead was a treasure trove of evidence, pieces of a puzzle that had been missing for years. The farm, once thought to be a simple, albeit strange, pig farm, had become a nightmarish crime scene. What they found next was even more chilling. In a small trailer, officers uncovered a disturbing array of evidence. A loaded .22 revolver with a dildo attached to the barrel, night vision goggles, and other bizarre items that seemed completely out of place. But the most unsettling discovery came when a videotape surfaced, recorded by one of Pickton's associates. In the video, Pickton could be seen explaining, almost nonchalantly, how he would kill women by handcuffing them, strangling them, and then bleeding them before feeding their remains to pigs. The level of depravity was unimaginable. The investigators couldn't believe what they were hearing. How had this been allowed to go on for so long? How had Pickton managed to conceal his monstrous actions from the authorities? It became clear that he had been operating with impunity for years, using the isolation of his farm as a perfect cover for his gruesome activities. As forensic teams began excavating the farm, the true extent of the horror began to unfold. Human remains were found buried beneath the soil, pieces of victims' bodies that had been discarded without a second thought. The pig farm, which had once been a place of quiet solitude, had become a grisly killing ground, a place where women had been butchered and their remains consumed by pigs. The authorities were overwhelmed by the scale of the investigation. They had only just begun to scratch the surface, but the evidence was undeniable. Pickton was arrested, and the charges against him mounted quickly. 6 women's names were added to the list of victims, but the police knew that there were many more. As they continued their excavations, they uncovered the remains of at least 20 more women, their identities still unknown. The case took a dark turn when Pickton was found to have confessed to an undercover RCMP officer, disguised as a cellmate, that he had murdered 49 women. He had boasted that he wanted to make it an even 50, but he claimed he got sloppy and was eventually caught. With each passing day, the investigation revealed more about Pickton's twisted psyche. He had carefully chosen his victims, most of them prostitutes or women living on the margins of society. They were vulnerable, easy targets for someone like him. And for years, the police had failed to connect the dots, dismissing the disappearances as a result of the women's lifestyles. But now, with the truth finally exposed, it was clear that Robert Pickton had been living a double life, one of a quiet, unassuming farmer, and another as a sadistic killer who had preyed on the most vulnerable members of society. However, despite the overwhelming evidence, there were still questions left unanswered. Why had Pickton killed? Was it for pleasure, obsession, or something deeper? And how many victims had he really claimed? The trial of Robert Pickton began in 2006, a decade after the discovery of his horrific crimes. The world had been shaken to its core, but nothing could prepare anyone for the grisly details that would emerge during the proceedings. The courtroom was filled with tension as survivors, families of the victims, and the public listened with bated breath to the chilling testimonies and the evidence that would shape the case. Pickton stood trial for the murder of 6 women, though he had confessed to the murders of 49 others. The court proceedings were harrowing, with families of the victims forced to relive the trauma of their loved ones' disappearances and brutal deaths. The physical evidence was damning: personal items of the victims found on Pickton's farm, DNA linked to the victims, and the testimony of his associates, who described the horrific acts Pickton had bragged about. The sheer scale of the crimes he had committed was beyond comprehension. Yet, despite this overwhelming evidence, The jury was forced to endure a trial where the possibility of additional charges and further suffering loomed. The defense mounted by Pickton's legal team was as chilling as the crimes themselves. They argued that the evidence, while compelling, was insufficient to prove first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Instead, they focused on casting doubt on the specifics of the murders, attempting to muddy the waters by questioning the legitimacy of the testimony and evidence. The emotional toll on the victims' families was palpable as they sat through the agonizing proceedings, knowing that their loved ones had been reduced to mere evidence in a trial that would never bring them back. Finally, after months of trial, the verdict came. Robert Pickton was found guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. It was not the full conviction the public had hoped for. Many still believed he was guilty of killing far more women than just the 6 charged, but it was a conviction nonetheless. He was sentenced to life in prison for second-degree murder in Canada at the time. Though Pickton's conviction brought a sense of justice for the families of the 6 women, it was a hollow victory. The case had taken years to reach its conclusion, and many of the other women who had been killed by Pickton would never receive the justice they deserved. Their names were lost in the media frenzy surrounding the trial, and the ongoing investigation into the remaining victims was abandoned when the additional charges were stayed in 2010. The families of these women were left with a painful reminder that justice had come too late for most. The public outrage was immense. Many felt that Pickton had not been held fully accountable for his actions. The trial had revealed the disturbing reality that the police had failed to act on the growing number of missing women for years, turning a blind eye to the disappearances and dismissing the cases as the unfortunate consequences of the women's lifestyles. It wasn't until the evidence was uncovered on Pickton's farm that the true scale of the tragedy became clear. The Missing Women Commission of Inquiry was formed to examine the police's failure to prevent the murders and to investigate the systemic issues that allowed Pickton to continue his reign of terror for so long. The inquiry revealed shocking lapses in judgment, prejudice against marginalized communities, and the deep-rooted societal neglect of vulnerable women, especially Indigenous women, who made up a disproportionate number of the victims. Robert Pickton's crimes didn't just destroy the lives of the women he murdered. They also shattered the trust between the public and law enforcement. The failure to investigate properly, the dismissive attitude toward the missing women, and the systemic indifference to the lives of those on the margins of society created a lasting wound in British Columbia, one that would take years to heal. For the families who had lost their daughters, sisters, and mothers, the emotional scars ran deep. The pain of losing a loved one in such a horrific and senseless way was compounded by the knowledge that the authorities had failed them time and time again. In the years that followed, the victims' families continued to demand justice, not just for the women who had been murdered, but for the larger issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. The Pickton case had exposed the deep flaws in the justice system and highlighted the need for a change in how law enforcement approached cases involving marginalized communities. The public outcry over the handling of the case led to the creation of the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls, an effort to address the ongoing crisis and ensure that no more women would disappear without anyone noticing. Robert Pickton died in May 2024, after being attacked by another inmate in prison. His death marked the end of a life filled with violence and brutality, but for the victims' families, it didn't bring closure. They had already spent decades living with the knowledge that their loved ones had been taken from them in the most violent and horrific of ways. Even with Pickton's death, the emotional toll on the families remained, as did the haunting questions of how many lives had been lost on that farm. How many women had been discarded like nothing more than refuse. The Robert Pickton case is a disturbing reminder of how systemic issues and societal indifference can allow monsters to thrive in the shadows. The women he murdered were victims of a society that overlooked them, neglected them, and ultimately failed them. As we reflect on this story, we must also remember the importance of protecting vulnerable individuals and giving them a voice in a world that often turns a blind eye. If you've been affected by this case or any other, make sure to leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe for more true crime stories, and hit the notification bell to stay updated with new content.